This is Robert Moffat, and this is Robert Morrison. Two Roberts, both missionaries, both working for the same organization, the London Missionary Society, which is the most ambitious Protestant evangelical society in the 19th century. Both of these men who spent their entire adult lives spreading the gospel of a man named Jesus from Judea to people who have never heard of it. So let's start with Robert Morrison. He goes east, and he was a bookmaker's apprentice who taught himself theology. And in the year 1807, the society then sends him off to China. And unfortunately, under the King law, it was illegal for any foreigner to preach Christianity. So he went undercover. He took a job as a translator for the East India Company in Canton while studying Mandarin in secret. And because of all his efforts, he then produced the first ever Chinese Bible. He also compiles the first Chinese English dictionary. He works in China for 27 years until he died in the year 1834. But the most fascinating thing to me is the fact that he spent 20 years in China and he was only able to baptize 10 Chinese converts. 27 years, only 10 people accepted the gospel of Jesus Christ. Just 10 in 27 years. Wow. And then let's talk about Robert Moffat, who went south. Robert Moffat was Scottish and he was born in 1795. He was a gardener's apprentice and he was only sent to South Africa by the society in 1817. This man was so audacious. He spent over 50 years in Southern Africa being a missionary. And during his time here in Southern Africa, he translated the Bible into Setswana, which was the first ever Bible in a Bantu language. By the way, his daughter Mary was the wife to David Livingstone. I'm sure every single Zimbabwean knows who this man is, the man who reportedly discovered Victoria Falls. And in the year 1859, when he was 64 years old, he traveled north of the Limpopo River to what is now called Zimbabwe, into the kingdom of the Ndebele. And King Mzilikazi, who was the king of the Ndebele, who he had known for more than 30 years, gave him permission to build a mission in a valley known as Inyati. So he built Inyati Mission, and other London Missionary Society men replaced him and lived there for the next 3 decades under Mzilikazi and then under Lobengula. And what is very fascinating to me is that under Mzilikazi and under Lobengula, they were unable to convert even one person. Inyati Mission made effectively 0 Ndebele converts. Not 10, not 5, not 1, 0. I'm 32 years old. So imagine, for all my life, they attempted and they failed to spread the gospel to the Ndebele kingdom. Just think about that. And yet today, Zimbabwe is 85% Christian and China is less than 5. How did this happen? This is exactly what we're going to be talking about in today's YAP session. Why was there initial resistance of Christianity in Zimbabwe? And why did we eventually embrace it? And why did China eventually reject it? This is the story of Rice Christianity, and welcome to my channel. My name is Edlin. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. If you're interested in the difficult conversations we have here, please click the subscribe button and the bell so that you can be alerted every single time I upload a video. I attempt to post 2 to 3 videos a week if I'm not lazy. But if you like my videos, comment on my videos, you give me motivation to keep making even more videos. So let's get right into it. So in the introduction of this video, I mentioned Rice Christian or Rice Christianity, and I want to define what it is. A Rice Christian is someone who converts to Christianity not because they believe, but because the missionary is handing out rice, food, school fees, medicine, or a job. The conversion is real on paper, but the motive is benefit. So the earliest example of this type of Christianity was in 1689. An English explorer named William Dampier wrote that French Catholic priests in what is now northern Vietnam were having more success with food than with sermons. He put it like this: alms of rice have converted more than their preaching. So missionaries discovered that when they gave benefit to communities, they had more converts than when they just preached the message of the gospel. This actually substantiates what we know about human nature. Human beings are largely selfish and are interested in their own benefit. This phrase was popularized in ancient China in the 19th century. There was apparently a famine, and missionaries quickly noticed that when they opened soup kitchens, crowds would swell with the hungry. But the moment that food ran out, people would disappear. And this is exactly why missionaries decided that wherever they would go, they would not just arrive with the Bible. They would arrive with an added benefit to whatever community they landed on. So when they traveled to India, Africa, or even the Pacific, they made sure that the Bible was in one hand and the Bible was in the other hand. So rice Christianity is not only talking about rice. It's not talking about food. It's talking about all manner of benefit. So it could be groceries. It could be a scholarship. It could be a school. It could be medicine. It could be healthcare. Anything that people are bound to benefit from this particular message is considered rice Christianity. So it's sort of like a motivation for people to be convinced of the message. If you actually pay attention to the two countries, you see that these countries had very different conditions. Maybe this is why one is now 85% Christian and one is only 5% Christian. So why in two countries the same gospel was preached? The same society was responsible for spreading the gospel, and yet the reception was completely different. So for there to be mass conversions in any society, you need three unique conditions. The first one is disruption. There has to be intense breaking down of that particular society. This could be due to war, this could be due to conquest, this could be due to famine or an epidemic. So because something traumatic has happened to the community, people have a feeling that the old gods have failed. There has to be some sort of religious shock in that particular community that makes people reject their way of life and adopt a new one. Number two is patronage. This is when the new religion is a religion of power. To some extent, this condition is political imposition. The one that is ruling you converts themselves and then they enforce it in that particular kingdom, community, or society. So let's say chiefs convert, kings convert, governors convert. And now people in that particular community or in that kingdom decide to do the same. Because this religion is no longer just a religion. It now has an arm of power. Like I said, sometimes it can even come as imposition because some of these kings and these chiefs will start putting laws and regulations in the particular country that may ban other religions or may start to reinforce their new religion on their subjects. Number three is the embedded benefits. The message itself comes embedded with certain benefits that cannot be found anywhere else. For example, the message in Zimbabwe came with schools, it came with hospitals, it came with jobs, it came with modernity, it came with technology, it came with better methods of farming, it came with literacy, it came with an easy life, it came with jobs. So converting to that particular religion becomes your ticket into entering this brand new world. So now we have established that there are three conditions that are very necessary for there to be mass conversions in a particular country. And if you look closely enough, Zimbabwe had majority of these. So obviously, by hitting these conditions, there was something in Zimbabwe that enabled mass conversion, and there was something in China that blocked it. So the main reason was that China already had an organized system of religion. They had a philosophy known as Confucianism that ran the state. They had Buddhism, which was very institutional, scriptural, and it was thousands of years old. They had Taoism, they had folk religion. There was no vacuum and there was no room. Number two, China had a literate elite, and these were called the Confucian literati. They were selected by examinations and they had their own intellectual tradition going back 2,000 years. In other words, they had their own organized way of learning, their own organized way of examination. They had their own technology. They had their own civilized state. So they did not need Christian schools. They did not need Christian books. I mean, these were the people that invented paper. They did not need help in that department. So the same tactic that was used in Africa could not work in China because they had their own system of learning. The elite already had an organized system of governing their country. They were not convinced. And that is exactly why, even though there was civil war, the elite never accepted Christianity. So they never effectively penetrated China and made it Christian. Now, if you look at Zimbabwe, it was quite the opposite. We also had pre-colonial religions in this country. We had Mondoro, we had spirit mediums, we had ancestral veneration. They were very powerful, but they were very local. We did not have a centralized religion across tribes. And the most important factors are that we did not have a written canon, we did not have a continental clergy, and we did not have institutional structure. So our religion was not fundamentally organized. And how could we have a written canon when we were not literate? We did not have a style of writing. We did not have recorded history. Everything that we spoke about in terms of our religion was very oral, and it was lineage based. So unlike in China, we did not have a scholarly class, people that literally lived only to read and understand how things work. Almost every condition that blocked mass conversion in China was absent here in Zimbabwe. So back to Robert Moffat. He was given permission by the king of the Ndebele Mzilikazi to build a mission in a valley known as Inyati. Although he was allowed to build a mission, it came with conditions. Mzilikazi seemed to have not wanted them to influence the culture in his kingdom. It seems he found the missionaries very useful. They were translators, they were iron workers, they were traders, but they could not convert anyone. So they managed to learn the Ndebele language, they opened a chapel, they preached every single Sunday, but they could not get a single convert for 30 full years. But why were they failing to convert the Ndebele people? It was definitely not the language, because the missionaries learned the Ndebele language. It was not because the Ndebele did not understand the message of Christ. They did. It was just because the Ndebele kingdom was strong. Remember when we spoke about the conditions that actually allow for mass conversions? One of it is the fact that there has to be some sort of catastrophe that wipes out the old system, and allows for the new. The Ndebele kingdom was very strong and it was stable. There was literally no need to adopt a new system. The second thing was that Mzilikazi himself had not converted. And remember, like we said, a lot of people convert because their kings or their governors or their chiefs also convert. Political imposition could not happen in this case. Lobengula also heard what the missionaries had to say, but he had a lot of concerns. He did not like that they attacked polygamy, because he himself had many wives, and the institution of polygamy was very political in his kingdom. And these people were calling it a sin, so he did not like that. And when they tried to tell him about the doctrine of original sin, apparently his response was that this was the religion for white men, not black men. He believed that whenever they did something wrong, they had to blame it on someone else. So for him, the concept of original sin did not make any sense. He believed that it was an attempt for human beings to scapegoat. So because Mzilikazi and Lobengula controlled access to their kingdom, missionaries had very little chance. So because the Ndebele state was strong and their traditional religion was very intact, there was literally nothing that could prompt people to mass convert to Christianity. And then something happens in the year 1888. Cecil John Rhodes. He sends representatives to Lobengula. They convince him through a translator he didn't trust to sign the Moffat Treaty in February. It is named after John Moffat, who is the son of Robert Moffat, the man we spoke about in the introduction, and he was now working as a colonial agent. Then later that year, they signed the Rad Concession. Lobengula thinks he's giving a few miners permission to dig, but he's actually signing under terms that he can't read the mineral rights of his entire kingdom. And then 2 years later, in the year 1890, Rhodes British South Africa Company sends what is called the Pioneer Column. This was about 200 settlers and 500 police into Mashonaland. They planted a flag at a place they called Fort Salisbury today, which is Harare, the capital. Unfortunately, 3 years later, in the year 1893, they pick a fight with Lobengula and invade Ndebeleland. The kingdom collapses within months. Lobengula flees north and dies in 1894. So the kingdom that had kept missionaries in their place for more than 30 years had finally collapsed. So now that the kingdom was no longer strong, there was now a vacuum. Christianity could now enter. A year later, in 1894, the company imposed a hat tax. Every African household had to pay in cash to live in their own home. But remember, most of these people live in the village. They have no cash. How are they going to get the cash? In other words, they had to leave their land and work for white settlers. And then 2 years later, in the year 1896, the rains fail and Africans depend on rain to eat. And then there was a cattle disease called rinderpest, which was brought by colonial livestock. It wiped out almost 90% of African cattle in a single year. And yet cattle was wealth. Cattle was the bride price. Cattle was the entire spiritual and economic structure of both the Ndebele and the Shona, gone only in a few months. The Sangomas and the mediums all interpreted this as the ancestors are angry. They did not understand that when the white settlers came, they brought disease. So they believed that if they drive out the settlers, the rain will come. This brought rise to the first Chimurenga, the first liberation war that was led at the spiritual level by two figures who are now national heroes in this country, Mbuyane Handa, a Shona spirit medium who was channeling an ancestral spirit, and Sekuru Kaguvi, who was operating in Western Mashonaland. So the uprising began in March of 1896 in Ndebeleland. and then it spread to Mashonaland by June. Mines were attacked, farms were burned, hundreds of settlers were killed, and then the British South Africa Company, with reinforcements and Maxim machine guns, crushed them. And by late 1897, it didn't even take a year, the rebellion was over. Nehanda and Kaguvi were captured. They were tried in a colonial court, and they were sentenced to death by hanging. So I want you to follow the timeline. For 30 years, missionaries failed to convert because the Ndebele kingdom was strong, because the Ndebele king was not converted, and because there was literally no vacuum. They had a very stable religious system. But because the Ndebele kingdom was destroyed, and because Mbuyane Handa, Sekuru Kaguvi, and the entire spiritual leadership of most of these tribes had been defeated, captured, hanged, or driven into hiding, the ancestors, according to them, had failed to save the land. Remember, it was the spiritual leaders that had told them that they would win, but they had failed. So it created a vacuum. Remember what we said? For a new to be established, the old order has to collapse. And this is exactly what happened to Zimbabwe. By 1897, the religious shelf had been cleared out. The political authority was gone. The spiritual authority was gone. The economy was gone. The cattle were gone. And the only institution that was still standing was the mission. So in Zimbabwe, the old order had completely evaporated. It had been dismantled. It had been destroyed. They could now enter. Now, before we go any further, we need to discuss why the colonizers wanted Africans converted. And in this case, we're going to say Zimbabweans because we are Zimbabweans here. Let's start with a story. In the year 1930, the governor of Southern Rhodesia gives a speech to a group of missionary leaders. This is the same year that the colonial parliament was passing the Land Apportionment Act. The governor stood up and said, "Do not, please do not, give these Africans the kind of education that creates an intellectual class. That class will challenge our dominance. Educate them by all means, but just educate them to become better farmers." So this is the colonial state that is telling the missionaries, the people that were running African education, what kind of education to provide to Africans. Don't make them intellectuals, make them farmers. Teach them how to grow food. Don't teach them how to think. Why? The reason why the colonial government wanted the Africans to be converted was so that they would be less intellectual. Christianity did three things for the British Empire. Number one, it produced a very disciplined workforce for the empire. Punctuality, sobriety, defense of authority, acceptance of suffering. These were valuable for the industrial workforce. They needed labor for their mines, for their farms, and for their industries. And they needed Africans to be good with obeying authority. A Christianized African was far much better than one who was not. Because if he was a Christian, it means he related with you, even if you were an overload to him, because both of you claimed to be part of the same religion. It made Africans accept being the underdogs in the situation. Number two, it needed missionaries because it outsourced the cost of African welfare. They did not want to pay for African schools. They did not want to pay for African hospitals. But what they really needed was a workforce. And this workforce had to know how to read instructions and not spread diseases to white areas. So then the missionaries filled that gap. They opened schools, they opened hospitals, they opened different centers. So the colonial state got an educated, healthier workforce without paying the bill, all paid for by overseas donation. Number three, they really needed missionaries, and they needed Africans to convert to Christianity because it produced cultural compliance. They attacked traditional ceremonies. They attacked spiritual mediums. And this was very smart because these are the very institutions that had brought about the first Chimurenga in 1886. Although the missionaries weren't really soldiers, they were undertaking what we now call cultural disarmament, which is very necessary for a new religion to take course. And we need to be fair, not all missionaries were weapons of the colonial government. There were so many missionaries that literally stood against white rule in Zimbabwe. So then multiple missions opened here in Zimbabwe. The Catholic mission at Shawasha, the Anglican mission at Penalonga, the Methodist mission at Wadlove, the Jesuit mission at Kutama. These became some of the only places in colonial Rhodesia where African children could get decent education on nominally European zoned land. Although there was no law that said that you needed to be a Christian for you to attend a mission school, the headmaster was usually a priest. The matron was usually a nun. And the textbooks had scripture on them. The school day began with prayer, and most children decided to get baptized because to them Christianity seemed like an upgrade. It came with modernity, it came with medicine, it came with literacy, it came with education. So many cool things that they had no access to before mission schools. It only made sense for people to adopt this because it seemed like a superior worldview. So no, Rhodesia did not actually pass a law to force Africans to convert, but the three conditions we mentioned earlier all were available. The patronage was there. This was the religion of the people in power. The benefits were there. You got medicine, you got education, you got better technology, better farming methods, etc. Number three, they had a destruction of the old order. There was more trust in this new order. So the hard tax forced you into wage labor, and wage labor required literacy, and literacy only came through the mission school, and the mission school encouraged conversion, and the conversion and the baptism was recorded through paper. So this was not just a single chain, it was actually a net. Majority of the conversion in this country worked through the mission school, and it worked through the hospital. Until the 1960s, the overwhelming majority of African children in Rhodesia who received any formal education in this country all received it through a mission school. By the time Zimbabwe became independent in the year 1980, almost every single Zimbabwean who was educated in this country had gone through a mission school. Their teachers were Christian, their books were Christians, their friends were Christian. 2 or 3 generations of that, and that religion is not foreign anymore. It's now part of who you are. Just imagine, during the colonial period, the only modern medicine available to most Black Zimbabweans was at a mission hospital. There was Mchavezi, Munene, Bonda, Howard, St. Teresa, Driefontein, hospitals that were run by Lutherans, Catholics, Methodists, Anglicans, Salvation Army. Just think about this. If your child had pneumonia, if your wife had a difficult birth, and if you had tuberculosis, the mission hospital was your salvation. Nurses were Christian. The chaplains visited every single ward and prayed with the patients. I want you to imagine that you're a mother and you have a severely ill child, and no sangoma, no nganga, no shikiro is able to give you a solution. And the only solution that you get that can save your child is a mission hospital. They give him medicine for free, and your child is alive because of these very generous people. What religion are you going to choose to raise your child in? Definitely Christianity. This is not emotional blackmail. This is not convert or die. It is much more powerful than that. It is gratitude. It is a debt. It is just that sense that this religion is on the side of life. And if Jesus can make these people do these things that can save lives, I better follow this Jesus. So for the first and the second generation Christians, they converted because of Rice Christianity. The conversion was because of the benefits that were attached to the gospel, the medicine, the education, the stability, the jobs. So Zimbabweans are largely Christians today because of the mass conversions that were done on our ancestors through Rice Christianity and through the conditions that were mentioned. And because these conditions were not available in China, the Chinese did not become Christians. My name is Edlyn, and thank you so much for watching my video. See you in the next one.